If you had asked me a year ago where my grocery money was going, I would have blamed prices. I would have pointed at the cost of meat, coffee, produce, cereal, paper towels, and almost everything else that seemed to cost more every time I walked into the store. But at 52, I finally did something embarrassingly simple. I put 4 weeks of grocery receipts on my kitchen table and counted how many times I had actually gone shopping, and that was when I realized the grocery store itself was not my biggest problem. My problem was how often I kept walking through its doors. I would do one big grocery trip on Saturday and feel organized. Then Monday afternoon, I would realize we were low on milk, so I would stop for milk, except I would also grab bananas, a bag of chips, and something from the bakery because I was already there. By Wednesday, I would remember that I needed an ingredient for dinner, so I would make another quick trip, and somehow that one ingredient would turn into $20 or $30. Then Friday would come, and I would convince myself we needed something easy for the weekend, and suddenly I had visited a grocery store 4 times in 7 days. None of those trips felt irresponsible on its own. That was the dangerous part. $10 here, $18 there, $27 on another stop. It never felt like I was blowing the budget. It felt like I was simply picking up a few things. But when I added those little receipts together, they told a completely different story. And in 2026, those little mistakes matter even more because grocery prices have not exactly returned to the old days. According to the latest July 2026 Consumer Price Index, food at home prices were still 2.7% higher than a year earlier. Fruits and vegetables were up 5.1%, and non-alcoholic beverages were up 4.1%. So even when inflation slows in some categories, a cart full of ordinary food can still feel surprisingly expensive. What surprised me even more was realizing that every extra grocery trip had another cost attached to it. I live in the kind of place where going to the supermarket usually means getting in the car, driving several miles, parking, walking through a huge store, standing in line, and driving home again. And in early August 2026, the national average for regular gasoline was around $4.08 a gallon, so those supposedly harmless store runs were costing me before I even put anything in the cart. That was the moment I decided to try one rule for a month. 1 grocery trips every 7 days, no Tuesday milk run, no Thursday snack run, no stopping at the store because I happened to be nearby. If I forgot something, I would find a substitute. If we ran out of something, I would see whether we could live without it until the next shopping day. And if I suddenly wanted something that was not on the list, it could wait. At first, that sounded almost too simple to matter. I had spent years thinking saving money at the grocery store meant clipping coupons, comparing unit prices, buying store brands, chasing weekly sales, or shopping at 3 different stores. And all of those things can help. But I had never asked the most basic question: how much would I save if I simply gave myself fewer opportunities to spend? Because every time I walked into a grocery store, I was making dozens of tiny decisions. The end cap was offering me something. The bakery smelled good. The snack aisle reminded me of something I had not planned to buy. A bright sale sign made a purchase feel smart, even when I did not need the product. And the checkout lane gave me one final chance to spend another few dollars. I began to understand that my grocery budget was not only being controlled by prices, it was being controlled by exposure. The more often I entered the store, the more often I gave myself a chance to add something unnecessary. So I stopped trying to become the perfect shopper and started trying to become a less frequent shopper. And after only 1 week, I noticed something I had not expected. The refrigerator was not nearly as empty as I thought it was. The pantry had more food than I remembered buying. The freezer was holding meals I had completely forgotten about. And suddenly the question changed from, what do I need from the store? To what can I make with what I already have? That question became the foundation of everything that happened next. Because before I could make one grocery trip last an entire week, I had to learn how to shop my own house first. The first week I tried shopping only once. I made a mistake that probably sounds familiar. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank grocery list and started writing down everything I thought we might want for the next 7 days: chicken, ground beef, bread, yogurt, fruit, cereal, pasta, cheese, snacks, frozen vegetables, coffee, eggs, and by the time I was finished, the list looked almost exactly like every other grocery list I had made for years. Then I opened the pantry, and that was when I realized I was about to buy food without knowing what food I already owned. There were 2 boxes of pasta behind a bag of rice, 3 cans of beans pushed into the back corner, canned tomatoes, oatmeal, peanut butter, tuna, flour, tortillas, potatoes, onions, crackers, and enough canned soup to get through several lunches. Then I checked the freezer and found chicken I had bought on sale, half a bag of frozen broccoli, ground turkey, 2 containers of leftover chili, bread, and a package of vegetables I did not even remember buying. I had been treating my kitchen like it was empty simply because the refrigerator did not look exciting. And that changed the way I thought about grocery shopping, because I realized that every time I went to the store without checking what I had, I was giving myself permission to buy duplicates, waste food, and spend money solving a problem that did not actually exist. So I created a new rule. Before I wrote a grocery list, I had to shop the house first, refrigerator first, because that food would spoil fastest, freezer second, because that was where forgotten money seemed to hide, pantry third, because those shelves were full of ingredients that never looked urgent enough to use. And instead of asking, "What sounds good this week?" I started asking, "What can I finish with what I already paid for?" That one question completely changed the list. Suddenly, I did not need ingredients for 7 brand new dinners. I needed a few missing pieces to turn existing food into meals. The chicken in the freezer could become tacos. If I bought lettuce and salsa, the canned beans and tomatoes could become chili with 1 pound of meat. The pasta could become dinner with frozen vegetables and a little cheese. The oatmeal covered breakfast. The tuna covered lunch. The potatoes could become a side dish one night and baked potatoes another night. And the leftover chili that had been hiding in the freezer could become the easiest dinner of the entire week. This was also when I started paying more attention to which foods were most likely to become expensive mistakes, especially fresh produce, because buying fresh food feels responsible until half of it ends up soft, wilted, or forgotten in the bottom drawer. And when prices are already elevated, throwing food away hurts twice, once when you pay for it, and again when you replace it. So I stopped buying produce based on good intentions and started buying it based on an actual plan. If I bought spinach, I needed to know where it was going. Eggs one morning, pasta one night, sandwiches at lunch. If I bought onions, they needed to work in 2 or 3 meals. If I bought peppers, I needed to use them early in the week instead of watching them slowly wrinkle until Saturday. And this made me understand something my grandmother seemed to know without ever calling it a system. A well-run kitchen is not about having endless choices. It is about making the same ingredients work more than once. I began building my week around foods that could overlap. Chicken could become dinner, then lunch, then wraps. Rice could sit under beans, vegetables, or leftover meat. Tortillas could become tacos, breakfast wraps, or a quick lunch. Eggs could cover breakfast, a simple dinner, or fill the gap if another plan fell apart. And little by little, my grocery list stopped looking like a collection of cravings and started looking like a list of missing pieces. I was not buying an entirely new kitchen every Saturday. I was filling the gaps in the kitchen I already had, and that distinction mattered because the old version of me would see a sale sign and think, "That's a good price, I should get it." But the new version asked, "Do I already have something that does the same job?" And if the answer was yes, I kept walking. This also made the once-a-week rule much easier, because when Wednesday came and I thought we were out of food, I had already done the inventory. I knew there was pasta, rice, beans, eggs, frozen vegetables, and leftovers available. There was no panic, there was only substitution. Maybe we were out of sandwich bread, but we still had tortillas. Maybe the fresh broccoli was gone, but frozen broccoli was waiting. Maybe the chicken I had planned did not thaw in time, but the freezer chili could save the evening. And that was when the biggest mental shift started happening. I stopped believing that running out of one specific food meant I needed another grocery trip. Because running out of bread was not the same as running out of food. Running out of bananas was not the same as having nothing for breakfast. Running out of one dinner ingredient was not an emergency. For years, I had treated inconvenience like necessity, and the grocery store was always there to rescue me. But once I removed that rescue option for 7 days at a time, I became much more creative with what I already owned. And by the end of that first week, something surprising happened. The refrigerator looked emptier, but in a good way. Leftovers had actually been eaten, produce had been used, the freezer had a little more space, the pantry made more sense, and my next grocery list was noticeably shorter. Not because I was eating less, not because I was depriving myself, but because for the first time in a long time, I was buying food to complete meals instead of buying food to create possibilities. And once I understood that, I was finally ready to build a 7-day grocery list that could survive real life, not a perfect week, not an imaginary week, but the kind of week where plans change, people get tired, and dinner still has to happen. Once I knew what was already in my refrigerator, freezer, and pantry, I thought the hard part was over. But then I discovered another reason I had been making so many extra grocery trips. My meal plans were too optimistic. I would plan 7 different dinners, as if every evening of my life was going to happen exactly the way I imagined it. On Saturday morning, Monday would be chicken with roasted vegetables. Tuesday would be homemade tacos. Wednesday would be a new pasta recipe I had seen online. Thursday would be soup from scratch. Friday would be fish. Saturday would be something special. And Sunday would be another completely different meal. On paper, it looked organized. In real life, it fell apart by Wednesday. An appointment ran late. I was tired. Somebody was not hungry for what I had planned. I forgot to thaw something. Or I simply did not feel like standing in the kitchen for 45 minutes. Then I would look at the ingredients I had bought for one very specific recipe and realize they did not help me much with anything else. And that was usually when I would make another grocery run. So I stopped building my week around 7 perfect dinners and started building it around 3 types of meals: anchor meals, flexible meals, and backup meals. Anchor meals were the dependable dinners I knew I would actually cook. Things like chicken and vegetables, chili, pasta, tacos, or a simple sheet pan dinner. I usually planned only 3 or 4 of those. Flexible meals were things I could move around depending on what happened during the week. Eggs and toast, baked potatoes, sandwiches, quesadillas, soup or leftovers, and backup meals were the foods that saved me when the entire plan collapsed. Frozen chili, canned soup, pasta with sauce, beans and rice, or something I had already cooked and frozen. This one change made my grocery list much more realistic because I was no longer pretending that every dinner needed its own set of ingredients. Instead, I started looking for overlap. If I bought onions, I wanted to use them in chili, tacos, and maybe eggs. If I bought spinach, it could go into breakfast, pasta, and sandwiches. If I roasted chicken on Monday, the leftover meat could become wraps on Tuesday or lunch on Wednesday. Tortillas could handle tacos, breakfast wraps, quesadillas, and leftover chicken. Cheese could work across several meals. Rice could sit under chicken one night and beans another night. And suddenly one ingredient had 3 or 4 jobs instead of one. That mattered even more when I looked at how differently food categories were moving in price. Because USDA's July 2026 Food Price Outlook was projecting beef and veal prices to rise about 7% for the year, while poultry was projected to rise only about 1%, which reminded me that a smart grocery list could not be so rigid that I had to buy one exact protein no matter what it cost. I began treating my list more like a plan with options, not a contract. If the beef looked expensive, maybe chili became turkey chili. Maybe tacos became chicken tacos. Maybe beans carried more of the meal. I still bought food I enjoyed, but I stopped believing that dinner failed if I could not buy the exact ingredient I originally pictured, and that distinction saved me from something I had done for years, walking into a store determined to buy a specific item simply because it was written on my list, regardless of the price. I started thinking in terms of jobs instead of products. I did not necessarily need ground beef. I needed a protein for tacos. I did not necessarily need fresh broccoli. I needed a vegetable for dinner. I did not necessarily need one particular cereal. I needed an easy breakfast. And once I thought that way, substitution stopped feeling like disappointment and started feeling like control. This also helped me handle another problem that used to send me back to the supermarket, the middle of the week change of plans. Maybe Wednesday's chicken dinner became Thursday's dinner because I got home late. That no longer meant I needed takeout or another store trip. Wednesday could become eggs, toast, and fruit, or baked potatoes with leftover chili, or pasta and frozen vegetables. Nothing glamorous, but that was exactly the point. I did not need every meal to be impressive. I needed the week to work. And at 52, I finally understood that the meals that protect a budget are often the boring ones. The dinner you can make half asleep. The lunch you can assemble without a recipe. The breakfast you already know everyone will eat. Those foods are not failures of meal planning. They are what make meal planning possible. So my 7-day list became shorter and more flexible. 3 or 4 main dinners, enough breakfast and lunch staples, 1 or 2 treats I actually wanted, produce with specific jobs, a few ingredients that could work in multiple meals, and backup food already waiting at home. I even started writing the meals beside certain grocery items so I could see why I was buying them. Spinach was not just spinach anymore. It was Monday eggs, Tuesday sandwiches, and Thursday pasta. Chicken was not just chicken. It was dinner plus 2 lunches. That made it much easier to remove things from the cart when I could not answer a simple question. What am I going to do with this? If I had no answer, I usually did not need it. And by the 2nd week, something else changed. I stopped feeling anxious when the refrigerator became less full near Friday, because I knew exactly what was left and what could become a meal. I no longer judged whether we had enough food by how crowded the refrigerator looked. I judged it by how many meals were still possible. And that was a completely different way of thinking. A refrigerator with 5 useful ingredients could be more valuable than one, packed with 15 things that did not work together. By the time Saturday came around again, I had learned one of the most useful grocery lessons of this entire experiment. The strongest shopping list was not the one that predicted the week perfectly. It was the one that still worked when the week went wrong. And once my list could survive real life, the next challenge became obvious. I had to deal with all those little things I used to convince myself were worth another trip to the store. By the 3rd week, I realized that cutting my grocery trips to once a week was doing something I had not expected. It was not only changing what I bought on Saturday, it was exposing all the little things I had been buying between Saturdays, the purchases that never felt important enough to remember. The bottled drink I grabbed because I was thirsty, the bakery item that looked good near the entrance, the bag of chips I bought because it was on sale, the extra fruit I convinced myself we needed, even though there was still fruit at home, the deli meal I picked up because I did not feel like cooking, the condiment I forgot was already sitting behind something in the refrigerator. None of those purchases looked reckless. Most of them were $5 here, $8 there, maybe $12 on a quick stop, but that was exactly why they had been so hard to notice. I was not making one huge mistake. I was making small spending decisions over and over again. And once I removed the midweek grocery trip, those decisions had nowhere to happen. One of the first things I noticed was how often I had been confusing convenience with necessity. If we ran out of bread on Wednesday, my old reaction was to go buy bread, but once I had committed to waiting until Saturday, I started asking a different question. What else can we eat? Maybe there were tortillas, oatmeal, eggs, leftover rice, or potatoes. Suddenly, bread was not an emergency. It was just one option that was temporarily unavailable. The same thing happened with bananas, yogurt, snack bars, soda, and dozens of other things I had once treated like household requirements. When something ran out, I learned to substitute, and that simple habit stopped a surprising amount of extra spending. Because the problem with going to the store, for one thing, is that stores are very good at making sure you do not leave with one thing. You walk in for milk and see a 2-for-1 display. Then you remember you are almost out of coffee. Then a package of cookies catches your eye. Then you pass prepared food and think dinner would be easier if you picked something up. By the time you reach checkout, the gallon of milk that brought you into the building may be the cheapest thing in your cart. And I began to see that impulse spending was not really about weakness or lack of discipline. It was often about exposure. If I did not walk past the bakery 4 times a week, I did not have to resist the bakery 4 times a week. If I was not standing in front of the snack aisle on Thursday night, I did not have to decide whether a sale was worth it. Fewer trips meant fewer decisions, and fewer decisions meant fewer opportunities to talk myself into spending. I also became much more careful about prepared and convenience foods because they were often what I bought when my original meal plan failed. I would stop for one missing ingredient and leave with rotisserie chicken, a prepared side, a dessert, and a drink, and suddenly I had spent almost as much as I might have spent on several meals at home. With restaurant and prepared food prices remaining elevated across much of the country, the difference between a planned meal and a convenience purchase can add up quickly. So I made one rule that helped more than I expected. Every week had to include at least 2 meals that required almost no effort, not fancy meals, not social media meals, just food I could make when I was tired, eggs and toast, quesadillas, baked potatoes, soup, pasta with frozen vegetables, leftover chili. Those meals became my defense against the expensive sentence, "I don't feel like cooking tonight." I also stopped buying backup snacks every time the pantry looked a little bare, because I realized something uncomfortable. Sometimes the reason we kept running out of snacks was simply because the more I bought, the more we ate. If there were 5 different snack choices, they disappeared quickly. If there were 2, everyone somehow survived until the next grocery day. I was not trying to make food miserable. I still bought treats, but I started choosing them intentionally during the weekly trip instead of adding them randomly all week long. And that made them feel more enjoyable, not less, because they were part of the plan instead of a reaction to boredom, hunger, or a sale sign. The biggest lesson came one Thursday evening when I opened the refrigerator and thought, for just a second, that there was nothing for dinner. The fresh produce was getting low, the sandwich bread was gone, and the meal I had planned no longer sounded appealing. 6 months earlier, I would have been in the car within 10 minutes, but this time I opened the freezer, found vegetables and leftover chicken, pulled rice from the pantry, added a little sauce, and 20 minutes later dinner was on the table. It was not exciting, but it cost me nothing extra that day. And that was when the whole experiment finally clicked. Running out of one food is not the same as running out of food. Being bored with what is in the kitchen is not the same as needing groceries, and wanting something different is not the same as having an emergency. Once I learned to tell the difference, those little midweek purchases started disappearing. And when those purchases disappeared, something else became impossible to ignore. Every trip I was no longer making was saving more than the cost of the food. It was also saving the gasoline, the driving, the time, and the hidden cost of turning a 5-minute errand into another opportunity to spend. By the 4th week, I had stopped thinking about grocery shopping as something that only cost me whatever was printed at the bottom of the receipt, because every time I made one of those quick trips, I was paying in more than groceries. I was paying for gasoline, driving time, wear on the car, and one more opportunity to spend money I had never planned to spend. And that became especially obvious in 2026, because for millions of Americans, particularly in suburbs, small towns, and rural areas, getting groceries usually means getting in a car, driving several miles, parking, walking through a large store, checking out, and driving home again. So when I used to say, "I'm just running out for milk," I was treating that trip as if the milk were the only cost. But by August 2026, the national average price for regular gasoline was about $4.08 a gallon, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which made those unnecessary drives much harder for me to ignore. I started doing the math differently, not obsessively, just honestly. If the supermarket was several miles away, and I made 3 extra trips during the week, that was extra fuel, extra mileage, extra traffic, and extra time for things I could probably have solved at home. And the strange thing was that gasoline was not even the largest part of the problem. The largest part was what happened once I got inside the store, because the trip that began with one forgotten ingredient rarely ended with one forgotten ingredient. I might spend $4 on the thing I needed and another 15 or 20 on things that happened to catch my attention. And once I saw that pattern, the once-a-week rule stopped feeling restrictive. It started feeling protective. I was protecting myself from a shopping environment designed to give me endless reasons to add one more thing. And I was protecting my time, too, because a so-called 10-minute grocery run was almost never 10 minutes. There was the drive there, finding a parking spot, walking through the store, maybe waiting behind someone with a full cart, driving home, putting everything away, and suddenly a small forgotten item had consumed 40 minutes of an evening. Multiply that by 2 or 3 extra trips every week, and I was giving away hours every month for errands I could often avoid with a little planning. And there was another part of grocery spending I had barely thought about before this experiment: taxes. Because the amount you pay for food in America can depend on where you live and what kind of food you are buying. Grocery tax rules are not identical across the country, and the difference between basic food, prepared food, candy, drinks, or restaurant meals can matter depending on the state and local rules. Arkansas gave me a perfect example of how these policies can change over time. Beginning January 1, 2026, the state reduced its state tax rate on qualifying food to 0. Although local sales taxes can still apply, according to the Arkansas Department of Finance and Administration, that does not mean everyone in America should shop the same way. And it definitely does not mean every grocery receipt is taxed the same way. It means something simpler. The final price of food is shaped by more than the shelf tag. Where you live matters, what you buy matters, and how often you choose convenience over planning can matter too. And once I understood that, I became much more careful about the phrase, "It's only one quick trip," because almost nothing about those trips was really quick or free. One extra run could mean gasoline, a few unplanned items, a prepared dinner because I was already there, maybe a drink for the drive home, and 40 minutes of my day. None of those things looked serious by themselves, but the entire point of this experiment was learning that small, repeated costs are exactly what quietly damage a budget, especially at 52, when I am trying to make more room for retirement savings, home repairs, insurance, utilities, medical costs, and all the other expenses that compete for the same paycheck. I did not need to turn grocery shopping into a military operation. I simply needed to stop treating the supermarket like an extension of my pantry. If I forgot something, I wrote it on next week's list. If we ran out of something, I looked for a substitute. If I wanted something different, I waited, and something surprising happened. Most of the things that felt urgent on Wednesday were not urgent by Saturday. Sometimes I forgot about them completely, which told me everything I needed to know. They had not been necessities, they had been impulses with good excuses. And by the end of that month, the one-trip rule had saved me something I valued almost as much as the money. It gave me back pieces of my week, fewer drives, fewer checkout lines, fewer decisions, fewer receipts, and fewer moments where I had to wonder how a $12 errand somehow turned into $38. And when I finally sat down to look at the full month, I realized the biggest change was not just that I had spent less. It was that my entire relationship with grocery shopping had become calmer, more deliberate, and much easier to control. At the end of the month, I pulled out my receipts again, the same way I had at the beginning, except this time the pile was smaller. There were fewer little slips from random Tuesday stops, fewer Friday convenience runs, fewer receipts with one necessary item, surrounded by 6 things I had never planned to buy, and what surprised me most was that I did not feel deprived. I was still eating the foods I liked. I still bought coffee, fruit, meat, snacks, and a few treats. I had simply stopped buying them accidentally. There is a big difference between deciding on Saturday that you want cookies for the week and walking into the store on Thursday for milk and coming home with cookies. Because you happen to see them, one is a choice, the other is exposure. And after 4 weeks, I finally understood how much of my grocery spending had been driven by exposure. Fewer trips meant fewer duplicates, fewer impulse buys, fewer convenience meals, less forgotten produce, more leftovers actually eaten, more freezer food used, and fewer moments when I opened the refrigerator and assumed there was nothing to eat, simply because there was nothing new. I also stopped measuring abundance by how full the refrigerator looked. That might have been one of the biggest changes of all. Before this experiment, a packed refrigerator made me feel secure. Even if half of what was inside had no real plan attached to it, now I would rather see a less crowded refrigerator where I know exactly what the food is for, 3 meals worth of vegetables, enough eggs for breakfast, leftovers for lunch, chicken for tomorrow, cheese for 2 dinners, fruit that will actually get eaten. That kind of kitchen feels calmer to me now because every item has a purpose, and that calm started carrying over into the rest of my finances. At 52, I have become much more interested in systems than motivation. Motivation changes from day to day, but a system can protect you when you are tired, busy, distracted, or tempted. My grocery system became very simple. On Friday, I check the refrigerator first, then the freezer, then the pantry. I look for food that needs to be used soon. I decide which meals can be built around what I already have. Then I write down only the missing pieces. I check the weekly ad or store app. If there is something worth comparing, I choose a few flexible proteins instead of insisting on one exact item. I make sure I have at least 2 extremely easy dinners for the nights when I do not feel like cooking. And then I shop once, preferably after I have eaten, because shopping hungry has never improved any budget I have ever made. When I get home, I put the foods that need to be used first where I can actually see them. I no longer hide produce behind containers and then act surprised when it goes bad. I use the most perishable foods early in the week, then gradually lean more heavily on the freezer and pantry. As the week goes on, fresh berries might be Monday and Tuesday. Frozen fruit can handle Friday. Fresh vegetables might carry the first dinners. Frozen vegetables can carry the last ones. Cooked chicken can become lunch before it disappears into the back of the refrigerator, and if something runs out early, I do not automatically replace it. I ask whether I can substitute, make something else, or simply wait. That one question has probably saved me more unnecessary trips than any coupon ever could. And I want to be clear about something. I do not think everyone in America is going to get the same result from shopping once a week. A family with teenagers will have a very different grocery bill from a household of 1 or 2 people. Someone living in Manhattan has different transportation choices than someone 20 miles outside a small Midwestern town. State and local tax rules differ. Food preferences differ. Medical diets differ, store access differs, and prices can change dramatically from one part of the country to another. So I would never tell someone that cutting grocery trips will magically save a specific number of dollars every month. What I can say is that reducing the number of times I entered the store reduced the number of times I was tempted to spend. And that is something I could actually control. I cannot control what beef costs next month. I cannot control fuel prices. I cannot control whether coffee, vegetables, insurance, utilities, or property taxes go up. But I can control whether I turn a forgotten jar of sauce into a $25 grocery trip. And that distinction matters more to me now than it did 10 years ago. Because at 52, I am looking at money differently. Every dollar I do not waste has another job waiting for it. Maybe it goes toward retirement. Maybe it stays in the emergency fund. Maybe it helps cover a home repair, an insurance increase, a medical bill, or a higher utility payment. None of those things are exciting, but neither is wondering why you earn enough money and still feel like it disappears faster than it should. And this experiment reminded me that financial progress is not always one dramatic decision. Sometimes it is removing one repeated behavior that keeps giving your money a way out. I thought I needed better grocery prices. What I really needed was fewer grocery opportunities. I thought I needed more discipline inside the store. What I really needed was to stop going inside so often. And maybe that is the most useful lesson I learned from this whole month. Saving money does not always mean finding a cheaper version of everything you buy. Sometimes it means buying fewer unplanned things in the first place. Because once I stopped walking through those grocery store doors 4 times a week, I stopped fighting the same temptation. 4 times a week, my food lasted longer. My pantry finally started shrinking instead of quietly growing. My freezer became useful again. My list got shorter. My week got calmer. And my spending became easier to explain. So if your grocery bill keeps creeping up, even though you feel like you are already buying carefully, do one thing before you blame yourself or the prices. Count your trips. Look at every little receipt. Include the stops that were just for milk. Include the convenience purchases. Include the food you threw away because you bought too much. Then ask yourself what would happen if you gave your kitchen 7 days to prove what it can do. Because at 52, I finally stopped treating the grocery store as the first solution every time something ran out, and that small change forced me to notice some things I should have learned. Years ago, there was already a surprising amount of money sitting on my pantry shelves, hiding in my freezer, and waiting in the back of my refrigerator. I just needed to use what I had before I went shopping for more.